As matters now currently stood, within the first 2 hours of the invasion, just within this sector of the invasion alone, the headquarters of the 72nd Infantry Brigade Combat Team was all but wiped out by the ferocity of the opening artillery salvos, as mentioned in the previous video, both howitzer and rocket artillery, dealing devastating blows, all as the river crossing was already underway into the nation by various subunits of the 10th Group Army spearheading this invasion prong. Barely any survived the ordeal within the headquarters of headquarters company of the entire 72nd Infantry Brigade combat team, with only 17 trudging wearily into captivity, shaken and worn out from the heavy barrage and having to run in panic away from it. This, as the battalions of the 165th Armored Brigade, rolling by on their advance, had dispatched one of their armored infantry companies from one of their different battalions to sweep the area and do a battle damage assessment and pick up enemy prisoners of war or put down any remaining resistance that survived the ordeal of the barrage, taking the 17 said prisoners of war into captivity. And out of the small handful who survived, including the POWs, there was an additional only 14 other men resorting to hiding in the mesquite tree and scrub brush wilds of the surrounding terrain outside of the city, just to the east of Loredo itself, having ran as fast as their legs could literally carry them, in a manner of speaking. Command and control elements such as these were hit particularly hard, mostly as a standard operating procedure, but also for simple redundancy reasoning, in order to decapitate the leadership forces, in order to prevent any potential means of potentially later escaping and regrouping behind the advance of coalition forces and thereby becoming a thorn in their side, potentially carrying out guerrilla-style attacks on lighter headquarters and or logistical units, thereby causing a very serious blow to the invasion forces, as their entire advance was heavily dependent upon said logistical elements within these different group armies, now advancing into the country. Within the city of Loredo itself, urban fighting had begun in earnest, with pitched back and forth exchanges of fire from rubble piles, which were formerly buildings before the artillery barrage, and any surviving buildings that were still standing, going into hour number 2 of the hostilities. Mechanized infantry battalions belonging to the 3rd Light Mechanized Infantry Division were avidly sweeping the city of all armed resistance, as securing the literal gateway into the center of America from Mexico via the absolutely vital invasion route of I-35. This was the prime objective of the entire invasion prong. And as the strike through the city was concerned, this also was surrounding pockets of armed civilians who were themselves putting up a token resistance with small arms and Molotov anti-tank / anti-vehicle weapons rapidly put together as a sort of homemade implement for use against the invaders' powerful vehicles from higher up floors and or rooftops on surviving buildings, occurring whenever and wherever it was even possible to deploy said implements. Although they found little to no success in this regard, more often than not, as they were almost always spotted first and dispatched due to the superiority of the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities as a whole of the coalition, with communications and streamlined decision-making processes by the leadership on the ground, resulting in such responses being levied out upon the defenders attempting to use these certain weapon systems against vehicles. One battalion of the Texas Guard constituted the only actual military forces within the actual city limits of Loredo itself, having set up campsites and parking lots and hardened parking garages that were closed to the public just only 24 hours prior to the invasion commencing, as America was now weary of danger and in anticipation of the Sino-Russian naval drills off of both coasts conceivably going wrong in some way. And although indeed they did, the size and scale of the invasion was drastically bigger than perhaps a vastly more limited attack of some sort that had been erroneously anticipated, as in anticipation was of a smaller type of attack and not a full-scale invasion. What was occurring exceeded the American imagination by such an extent, most of its populace was literally dumbstruck by it and immobilized, and in the dark, both literally and figuratively, at least until the savage combat itself was right overhead. Only a small handful of armed and reactionary civilians stepped up at first and were slaughtered for it, while the drastically more wise among the civilian population fled to the wilderness and took as many supplies as possible with them in order to establish some type of logistical systems, get organized properly, strategize, and pick competent leadership in order to delegate specific tasks among these partisan groups that were to come in the future, in the near future. While yet even more of the population became war refugees, out of which more of these refugees would get limited or perhaps even more advanced training upon themselves meeting up with skilled individuals like those who were currently at the time or previously at least affiliated with the armed forces, or perhaps other individuals embodying other qualifying factors and traits in a similar regard to those with the armed forces affiliations, while the armed civilians within Loredo numbered under 700 within city limits, and the one combat battalion in the form of the 3rd Battalion of the 138th Infantry Regiment together resisted overwhelming numerical and qualitative odds by hour number 2, Club Ks and YJ-18Cs added to the pandemonium, which all began to fly out of the well over 10,000 such container-based systems located all throughout the land. With 4 missiles per system, 40,000 total missiles flew in salvos that were all timed and made, therefore, to fire all 40,000 by 10 a.m. in the morning from the start of the salvos beginning at 2 a.m., which was only 2 hours into the conflict itself. The purpose for them being timed to fire in different salvos over that long of a span of time was to add to the shock and awe factor and keep all of these missiles constantly traveling through the skies for as long as possible from the container-based systems, as this was only one component of the missile systems employed, as there were air-delivered, TEL-based delivered land-based systems, and of course sea-based missile systems of varying sorts and varieties. Due to all of the sheer disadvantages possessed by the American side within the city, as well as everywhere else in general, urban guerrilla tactics were employed to a large degree, whenever and wherever possible and necessary, although for the American military forces, being the Guard forces, such was only possible for them when it pertained to their dismounted infantry forces, as they were still reliant upon their standard military tactics due to the use of their vehicles. For the armed civilians, the use of asymmetric fighting was the proverbial order of the day, as it was said, as they had no such restrictions holding them back from such, as it pertained to vehicles that they had to man and use in combat. In this one small segment of the larger battle within Loredo City, I-35 was right here with entrance and exit ways onto the highway, as it started not very far from this point, near the actual border itself, only 1 kilometer, or roughly 1 kilometer from the actual border crossing bridge. What was occurring here was essentially clearing all potential hazards from the periphery of the interstate itself, as again, the interstate was the prime objective of this entire campaign in this one area, because this was the most strategically important artery as far as an invasion route, if not the most important of all the invasion routes itself, into the land for the externals, because this literally practically bisected the country in two. And for the external forces racing deep inland to reinforce the Trojans, occupying this and clearing it for security purposes to enable easy transportation for their group armies was of paramount importance. It was, again, perhaps the most important objective in this entire battle, in this entire region, as far as the border. There were other important invasion routes, but I-35 was definitely perhaps the most important of all. Now, when this battle was occurring, this was happening in this area adjacent to the highway in northeastern Loredo City. Now, different battalions had come into the city from different axes of advance. Some battalions were busy surrounding and destroying armed civilian pockets, fighting armed civilians who dared to challenge them on their flanks here and here. There were other battalions who were fighting the American battalion, the 3rd of the 138th Infantry Regiment, in the northeastern part of the city, even before advanced units began to move further up adjacent to the highway in order to clear the adjacent areas of any potential security threats. Within the city, due to the urban nature of the fighting, certain types of vehicle maneuvering were somewhat restricted, not just by all the rubble and the layout of the grid street patterns, but also because the delicate nature of trying to capture the highway it relatively intact, or at least completely intact, which was the main objective, was somewhat difficult, as due to the American armed forces being so close to the highway, precision strikes from artillery had to be very carefully meted out upon the American forces in the area, because they couldn't risk potentially damaging or destroying the interstate due to its close proximity to the fighting. So great care was taken in order to prevent damage to the interstate, as very shortly after the whole Battle of Loredo was to end, as it was even coming to an end, all Group Armies 7 through 13, including the 10th, spearheading the invasion in just this sector, this invasion prong, were about to get on the highway and proceed on their long journey towards Kansas. Some Group Armies would peel off along the way there, but most would fan out upon reaching Kansas. So, in this area, there are 2 mechanized infantry companies of the whole battalion, and these forces generally had to move due to no communications, due to the anti-satellite and cyber attacks, no military networks, and their radios were being jammed. They had no communications. The radios were jammed due to the 10th Signals Regiment's Electronic Warfare Battalion jamming their signals of their SINGARs and other radios. So what was occurring was the 3rd Light Mechanized Infantry Division, just in this one segment of the larger urban battle, had 4 companies just in this area belonging to one battalion. So the battalion is 8 companies, a headquarters company, and of course the combat companies that comprise it. So here is one company of light infantry manning their WZ-551 infantry fighting vehicle and armor personnel variants of the same vehicle type, with the IFV, again, boasting a 25mm autocannon 7.62 coax machine gun, although no anti-tank pods on the sides of the turret, but the infantry troops carried anti-tank weapons who could dismount and use them. But on the armor personnel carrier version of the WZ-551, a heavy machine gun, be it a very potent 14.5mm anti-materiel machine gun or a heavy W85 12.7mm machine gun, could be mounted, both very heavy, both very destructive as far as their capabilities to penetrate building materials and even certain vehicles, would be used as the crew serve weapons on the armor personnel carrier variants. Now, here you have, behind this company already taking position for this ambush, remember the ISR capabilities could survey the whole battlefield. They knew where the Americans were and where they were moving, and as a result of knowing where they were going, and the result of them having no communications or ISR assets to know where they even were until it was too late, they were able to, at leisure, set up an ambush, as these units had to slinky, essentially. Like they had to move in a caterpillar type of, they had to stay within earshot of one another, within eye contact. They had to move like a giant caterpillar, where you had 2 companies leading the way, scouting ahead, moving very slow, with other companies following up behind. They might take a pause and then move, and then the others move behind them. While this was all occurring, you had various companies of different battalions, this just being part of one battalion, a company here to block the front in a blocking formation. You had a company moving behind them, and behind these two companies, which was a WZ-550, which is a four-wheeled anti-tank vehicle that carried 4 HJ-9 anti-tank missiles. You had them moving behind these two companies, which were basically interspersed together. You had a mechanized infantry company here and the anti-tank company here. And you had their two headquarters elements here and here, respectively, in these parking lots where they were able to set up a sort of defensive star formation with their VP-11 MRAPs or Tiger MRAPs. And there was other types of MRAPs as well, besides just those two types. But those two types I listed were very common types of MRAPs. And you would have their support vehicles like their fuel truck, their trucks like their standard military supply trucks and command vehicles, and also armored recovery vehicle taking position in the middle of the MRAPs, guarding them in these star formations of the MRAPs. And this company was moving behind the blocking company and moving behind these two that were interspersed to hit them from the side. They were making a giant L, just like shown on the map. This was a giant L formation. You had the third of the 138th moving gradually and slowly down the streets, as they had already been basically getting shelled by this point from the artillery coming from the 3rd Light Mechanized Infantry Division's own artillery, being these PCL 181 artillery howitzers firing from across the river, across the border in Mexico, from various different border combat outposts such as this, where they had pre-prepared firing positions that were fairly secure with sandbagged ammo dumps, HESCO barrier and concertina-topped HESCO barrier walls, guard towers with machine guns, the whole works, as it were. So you had all these batteries belonging to these artillery battalions, which the 3rd Light Mechanized Infantry Division had too. They were already busily shelling virtually the whole city. And as a result, the Americans had to flee their bivouac areas. They had tents set up further away where they had parking areas in the city that were requisitioned for military use by this very battalion. And they were already being hit by artillery, so the vehicles and troops scrambled to get out as fast as possible, as well as some that were in underground parking garage, much as like this one. This is a parking garage, a multi-floor one, with an underground floor as well in it. As you can see, the circular corkscrew ramp going up here to the very top of the parking garage. There's an entryway into the bottom floors. And these are the streets here. Over here by this gas station and this parking area, on the other side of the highway, you had an American squad just here, just trying to scout ahead and see where the enemy was so that they could run back and relay information to their slower moving vehicles. But by the time they were already moving into position here and the squad broke into two parts to bound and cover tactically, as far as movements were concerned, they were already beginning to be engaged by these two Chinese infantry squads of dismounts who had been dismounted from these two armor personnel carriers on the end here and were clearing the flanks, as they had used their squad level tiny quadcopter drones to survey this whole area on this side of the highway belonging to each squad. Each squad had one, and they surveyed this area and spotted them first. They spotted the Americans first, so they were able to have an advantage of knowing where they were. Again, these squads and platoons all had their own squad and or platoon level quadcopter recon drones, and these would be very small, so they're not on the map, but there would be also so many of them it's pretty much pointless to put them on the map. They could fly fairly high or low, depending on the need, and they were fast and small and nimble, and would relay the data back to the combat data links and also to be processed through the central AI system that would update things as far as intelligence reports and sorting the information itself to make the responses of commanders on the ground much more flexible and, as far as response time, very, very much faster. Americans had no such thing, as all their capabilities in terms of ISR and intelligence gathering had been eliminated by the anti-satellite strikes, the cyber attack, and the electronic warfare even hitting the redundant communication systems. And also even certain radars that could be generator powered were gone too, as they were some of the first targets to be struck. As these forces moved down the street, they were also hit by the ubiquitous, or seemingly ubiquitous, CH-901s, which could be fired in large numbers, 48 at a time, from specialized headquarters units, subunits of a headquarters unit, like drone sections that they would have in large headquarters battalions of these big units, which would fire these in 48 drone salvos at a time, and they could stay airborne again for over an hour, and they would either carry a fragmentation warhead, a heat warhead, which stands for high explosive anti-tank, or it could carry an HE warhead, which is high explosive. So they flew over the area. You have another squad here trying to peel around the building and bound across the street here to this parking garage, ostensibly to take cover from the artillery beginning to hit the area, precision strikes, as these drones relayed data back and these elements were seen. The ambush was officially set off. But this was a fairly large area of the city. This was a 1.5 by 1 mile area of the city where this ambush was occurring in the downtown area. Now, these two mechanized infantry companies slowly coming down were initially beginning to be hit, their front vehicles, by 155 millimeter howitzer shells from the 3rd Light Mechanized Infantry Division's own artillery, divisional artillery, which they had 2 whole battalions of these batteries that comprised these artillery battalions of PCL 181s, which laid waste to many buildings, as rubble piles were what these buildings were reduced to. And as these forces advanced, artillery strikes began to fly in and hit this area as well. And this area had already been reduced to rubble from prior strikes earlier on anyway, when they were firing at armed civilians that were spotted via drone footage running through these areas. Now they were to be hit again as these American forces drove right into an ambush unwittingly, as again they had no way of knowing where they were going, hence the reason why they had to travel extremely slow and delicate down the streets and within visual or earshot of each other in order to send runners between the groups of vehicles to relay communications, as their radios were jammed by the electronic warfare systems of the 10th Group Armies, 10th Signals Regiment. Other infantry forces were moving ahead to attack from this rubble pile with anti-tank systems like man-portable HJ-08 anti-tank systems to hit these Bradleys, M113s, LMTV trucks, M88 armored recovery vehicle, fuel truck. These are the headquarters vehicles back here. Of course, additional Bradleys of the headquarters unit. Now, these in the red were already being hit and destroyed by the heat warhead-laden CH-901s, as well as these here, which are already in the red. These are being hit as well. And also, they're being hit by these WZ-550 anti-tank wheeled systems, which again had 4 HJ-09s apiece instead of the 08s, and also by the infantry fighting vehicles firing their very powerful blasting-tipped 25 millimeter autocannons, along with their crew serve weapons on the armor personnel carrier versions of the WZ-551. So you had the 550, which is a four-wheeled anti-tank system, and then you had the 551 APC and IFV variants of the infantry forces, and they were firing their crew serves and 25 millimeter autocannons, as well as their HJ-09 anti-tank missiles down the streets or through any openings they could, like this plaza here that had an opening where they could see over this rubble pile and into the street. They were being hit by HJ-9s, CH-901 loitering munitions, as shown here, 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 here. These vehicles taking up rear security, these two Bradleys. These two command vehicles of the headquarters platoon being hit by these two CH-901s, these two on the side hit by CH-901s, all of these being hit by artillery shells en masse, either destroying the vehicles completely, or if they didn't destroy them immediately, they at least destroyed the tracks and immobilized the vehicle, or so badly destroyed the weapons on the turrets that they were unable to be used at all whatsoever. And the concussive blast waves normally killed the crews inside or severely injured them to the point to where they were unable to operate anyways. The artillery is highly destructive, to say the least. As this company went around to maneuver itself into position off the map as more fighting was going on to the north, these were just the two advanced companies of the whole battalion, of the whole 3rd of the 138th Infantry Regiment. This was just the two advanced scouting companies, which were being used in a scouting capacity. These were mechanized infantry companies, but being used in a scouting capacity, as again, these forces had to move slow and deliberately, sort of like a caterpillar stopping every so often before moving again, in a long chain of companies comprising the whole battalion. Further to the north, other companies of the battalion were being hit just as viciously by other companies of the same or other battalions in the area belonging to the 3rd Light Mechanized Infantry Division. Now again, they had to quickly obtain control over all areas adjacent to the highway and clear them of any type of enemy threats and enemy activity. So these two squads went under this highway here. As you can see, it's an elevated highway with the struts holding it up. They ran and bounded and covered, bounded and covered. One would lay fire, the other would move, they'd lay fire, they'd move, they'd lay fire, and they'd move again and lay fire. As they did the same, this one American company was doing the same, as it is split up into two groups in order to bound and cover and make use of that type of tactic. With this one trying to take cover around this highway entry ramp, only to be wiped out in the exchange of small arms fire, as these light mechanized infantry squads were armed with your standard small arms and some light anti-tank systems like the enormously mass-produced Type 69 rocket-propelled grenades, occasionally with HJ-08 systems as well, which were heavier actual anti-tank missiles as opposed to unguided anti-tank rockets like the lighter Type 69 systems and much older systems were. And they also had their QJY-201 squad automatic 5.8 by 42 millimeter light machine guns, which were belt-fed 5.8 by 42 millimeter light machine guns, the same caliber of round that was used in their QBZ-95 assault rifles of the infantry here. There were several different rifle types in the service of not just the PLA, but also its paramilitary forces, although due to their enormous mammoth size of their paramilitary, older iterations of rifles, such as the old Type 56s, often armed a lot of these third-tier paramilitary forces, while the actual military forces of the PLA, whether it's its ground forces, Navy, Air, PLAAF, Air Force, and strategic missile forces, got the QBZ-95s or the QBZ-03s as their main armaments as far as a standard issue rifle, which both types of those rifles fired the 5.8 by 42 millimeter cartridge. This company, by the time it got to the end and formed up with other companies of the same or other battalions to the north, the fighting here was just winding up, with these first two American companies being completely annihilated. Even as their infantry tried to cross here, they too would be wiped out, as the arrow indicates, by loitering munitions in the area. And over here, the exchange of small arms fire was extremely vicious, but these two parts of this one American squad, which broke into two segments to bound and cover, were both wiped out. But there were Chi-Com casualties in this ambush. Even so, even as perfectly laid out of an ambush as it was, they did have damaged vehicles insofar as their wheeled armor personnel carriers were concerned, these two having taken direct hits from American weapon systems, such as the 20 millimeter autocannon on the Bradley or the 50 caliber, the M250 caliber crew serve machine guns. And there were a few Chinese KIA'd in this exchange of small arms, and a few wounded, but the body armor definitely did its job and preserved the lives of most involved out of these two squads. And although the Americans too wore body armor, most of them succumbed to Chinese light anti-armor weapons like the Type 69 rocket-propelled grenade systems in tandem with the small arms fire, with many having been hit in the head due to the sporadic exchange of fire, as both elements tried to close the gap with each other to pour down accurate fire. As the WZ-550s fired their very potent HJ-09 anti-tank missiles at the columns of Americans rolling down the street. So they could hit either column as the range of these missiles could also hit this column as well. If they didn't hit vehicles in this one, they could target vehicles in this one as well. The 25 millimeter autocannon fire from both sides created an L-vectored zone of interlaced fields of fire. And these infantry forces did not bound any further due to the fire of these forces going this way. Vectoring fire, elevation and traverse of weapon systems, and precise calculations for artillery strikes was again of dire importance, not just to avoid friendly fire incidents, but also to avoid damaging or potentially even destroying part of the interstate. But the artillery did do its job and do it proficiently in the case of this specific battle, putting steel on the target with great precision. The Battle of Loredo roared on with blasting munitions, thunderous booms heard for many miles, not just in this specific sector of the invasion, but all throughout the nation, as all but the very most tertiary of areas could hear the immense blasting now occurring near ubiquitously across the nation. As the Americans were blinded and lacked any effective communications, reconnaissance in force, and maintaining a nearly line-of-sight sort of line of communications and logistics indeed caused the companies of the 3rd of the 138th Infantry Regiment to move throughout the city again like a sort of amoeba or caterpillar, slinking along in a concentrated grouping of the whole battalion, seeing their vehicles via drone footage from several drones circling just this one AO, not to discount the literal hundreds of quadcopter and smaller unit-level drones of the various battalions comprising companies. It was fairly simple to outflank and set up a kill box for the Chi-Coms in rapid succession, in anticipation of the blind American battalion stumbling headfirst into it. Adding to the urgency of destroying the American battalion was that it was moving adjacent to I-35. And therefore, being in such close proximity to the highway itself could put supply lines greatly at risk due to the need for supply convoys of all of the soon-to-be crossing massive Group Army elements, which comprised a many miles long train of vehicles, at risk potentially. All of this due to these Group Armies moving upon a very strict timetable and could not afford for their progress to be slowed down, even for a matter of hours. The Battle of Loredo continues in the next video as the forces continue to advance deeper and deeper inland, outmaneuvering and outflanking their enemies at every turn, as the ISR capabilities, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance apparatus of the coalition, China, Russia, and their allies, could always see the enemy before the enemy could see them, as it related to the Americans and the coalition seeing them first.